Hello family, welcome to Stories With. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you. As you do, so sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The grand opening of Silverstone Hotel's latest luxury location shimmered with elegance and excess. Towering chandeliers bathed the marble floor in a golden glow, and the sounds of a live jazz band danced through the expansive ballroom. Wait staff dressed in crisp black and white uniforms weaved seamlessly between guests, offering trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Among them was Emily Ramirez, carefully balancing a silver tray as she maneuvered through the crowd. This was her third event shift this week, and exhaustion weighed on her feet, but the overtime pay was necessary. Raising two young boys alone didn't leave room for rest. Emily kept her head down, dodging the flirtatious comments from guests and the occasional rude remark. As if invisible, the catering uniform too tight at the waist made her feel anything but glamorous, in a room filled with designer gowns and tailored suits at the center of the event. Daniel Silverstone, the man of the hour, held court flanked by business associates. He smiled for photographers, exuding the confidence of someone accustomed to success. Silverstone Hotels was his empire, and tonight this new addition to his collection symbolized another milestone as the evening progressed. Daniel wandered through the ballroom personally greeting guests when his eyes landed on Emily. Something about her caught his attention. She stood by the bar delicately arranging drinks on a tray. Daniel wasn't the type to be drawn in easily, but there was a softness in her profile, a quiet resilience that intrigued him. He approached casually, striking up small talk. Emily met his gaze, surprised by his directness. She responded politely but cautiously, aware of the divide between their worlds. As the night wore on, Daniel found excuses to stay near Emily, impressed by her humility and quick wit. One moment led to another. A shared glass of champagne after her shift. Laughter in the quiet corners of the hotel. Emily hadn't intended for anything to happen, but the chemistry between them was undeniable. By the time they found themselves in his suite, the lines between impulse and loneliness blurred in the soft glow of city lights. Pouring through the window, Emily forgot the weight of her struggles, if only for that night. But as dawn crept in, reality resurfaced before Daniel woke. Emily slipped away, leaving nothing but the faint scent of her perfume and the lingering warmth of the night. Behind her, Emily sat on the edge of the bathtub staring at the pregnancy test. Resting on the sink, two pink lines, bright, unmistakable, and life-altering. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the cold porcelain, struggling to process what lay ahead. The room felt smaller, the weight of her new reality pressing down on her memories of that night. At the Silverstone Hotel flooded back the charm in Daniel's smile, the way his eyes lingered, and a brief escape she allowed herself. But that was supposed to be a fleeting moment, not the start of something permanent. She couldn't call him. Their lives had intersected for a single evening. Reaching out now felt impossible. What could she even say? Surprise, you're going to be a father to twins. The thought alone made her chest tighten. Days passed, but the dread never eased. Emily worked double shifts, hoping the fatigue would drown out her thoughts. But no matter how many hours she logged, her mind circled back to the test hidden at the back of her drawer. Her closest friend and coworker Trina noticed the change. "You've been quiet lately," she nudged one evening as they wiped down tables. After closing, Emily hesitated, biting her lip before finally admitting the truth. Trina's eyes widened, but she squeezed Emily's hand with quiet reassurance. "You've handled worse," she said gently. Emily nodded, but doubt lingered. Her life was already a balancing act, juggling rent bills and barely affording daycare. Adding two infants to the mix felt like an insurmountable climb, yet deep down, she knew she wouldn't take the easy way out. These babies were hers, and she'd fight to give them the life they deserved. That night, Emily lay awake, one hand resting over her stomach. The faintest flutter of protectiveness stirred within her, a connection forming long before she'd even met them. She whispered promises to the empty room, vowing to protect them, love them, and never let them feel like a mistake. There was fear, yes, but also a quiet resolve growing stronger with each passing moment. whatever challenges lay ahead. Emily wouldn't let this define her as a victim she'd raise these children on her own term, even if the path forward felt uncertain and lonely. Emily's tiny apartment barely contained the chaos that came with newborn twins. Lucas and Jonah arrived early, fragile and small, spending their first few weeks in the NICU. The medical bills piled up faster than she could count, leaving her nights filled with tears and exhaustion, nights blurred into mornings as she juggled diaper changes, feedings, and colic that seemed never-ending. Sleep became a luxury, and her body ached from constantly holding one twin while trying to comfort the other. Sometimes both boys cried for hours, in unison, overwhelming her to the point where she sat on the kitchen floor, crying with them. There was no one to call for help. Family wasn't an option. Her parents had passed, and her brother lived out of state with a family of his own. This was her fight alone. Her days were no easier. Emily took on as many catering gigs as she could, leaving the twins with an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Sanders, who helped out for minimal pay. Every dollar earned stretched thinner. By the week, Emily became adept at making one pack of diapers last, cutting corners where she could when Mrs. Sanders fell ill. Emily had no choice but to bring the twins to a catering job, strapping them into a double stroller tucked behind the kitchen door. Her boss, though sympathetic, warned it could happen again. Emily left that night in tears, wondering how much longer she could keep this up. Every decision felt like walking a tightrope, each mistake threatening to unravel the fragile stability she had built. Yet in the rare quiet moments, Emily found strength when Lucas gripped her finger with his tiny hand, or when Jonah's sleepy eyes followed her around the room. She felt purpose. She wasn't just working to survive, she was working for them. The weight of responsibility became a fuel that pushed her to continue, even when it seemed impossible. The exhaustion, the endless bills, and the sleepless nights were nothing compared to the love she held for her boys. As challenging as motherhood had become, Emily clung to the belief that one day they would look at her and know she had given them everything she could. The Silverstone Hotel shimmered with the same glow it had 5 years ago, though, for Emily, stepping through its polished doors felt like entering another life. This time she wasn't here as a guest of the owner's attention, but as part of the catering staff. Lucas and Jonah were now 5, and she balanced raising them while working multiple jobs to keep them clothed and fed. The Silverstone Hotel's events paid well, and Emily couldn't afford to turn down shifts dressed in her usual catering uniform. She kept her head down, arranging silverware and folding napkins with practiced ease. The room bustled with activity, but her goal was simple: finish the shift, collect her paycheck, and return home to her boys. But fate had other plans. As Emily maneuvered through the crowd, she caught sight of a familiar figure across the room. Daniel Silverstone. Time had been kind to him. His tailored suit fit perfectly, his presence still commanding, as he laughed with guests and gave interviews to reporters covering the hotel expansion. Emily froze, her stomach twisting in knots. She hadn't expected to see him again, certainly not like this. Her hands trembled as she turned to slip away, but it was too late. Daniel's gaze drifted across the room and landed on her, his eyes narrowed, recognition flickering behind them as his easy smile faltered. Daniel excused himself from his conversation and crossed the room in long strides. Emily, his voice was with disbelief, his expression unreadable. Emily straightened, masking her panic with calm indifference. "Mr. Silverstone," she replied, keeping her tone professional. Daniel's gaze shifted, and before Emily could guide him away, his attention locked onto Lucas and Jonah. The twins, seated quietly in the corner, mirrored his every feature. The resemblance was striking, impossible to ignore. Daniel's eyes widened in shock. Realization dawning. "Are those?" he began, but Emily cut him off swiftly. "It's a long story," she said tightly. She braced herself for the confrontation she had long dreaded, knowing there was no running this time. Emily's heart pounded as Daniel's gaze flicked back and forth between her and the twins. The questions hanging on his lips were visible in his furrowed brow, but she refused to let panic show. With a deep breath, she straightened her posture, forcing herself to meet his eyes without wavering. "Yes, they're yours," she admitted, her voice calm but edged with wariness. Daniel blinked, as if the words hadn't registered. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, though the disbelief cracked through mine. His eyes softened as he glanced over at Lucas and Jonah, who were now fiddling with their toy cars, oblivious to the weight of the moment, unraveling around them. Emily felt the invisible wall she built for 5 years begin to crack. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said flatly, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "And I didn't think you'd want to know." Daniel's head snapped toward her, his expression tightening. "You didn't think I want to know. I have children." His voice rose slightly, but he reined it in. Careful not to draw attention, Emily crossed her arms defensively, holding her ground. "I didn't have the luxury of guessing how you'd feel. I did what I had to do for them." She cast a glance toward the twins, her heart aching. Under the weight of her decision, Daniel's shoulders sank, the anger giving way to something else: guilt, confusion, regret. "I would have been there," he whispered, though even he seemed unsure of his own words. Emily wasn't convinced. "Maybe, but I couldn't take that risk. You said it yourself that night. You're not the settling type, remember? You made it clear back then that commitment wasn't your thing." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the memory of his words. The silence between them thickened, but Daniel's eyes didn't leave the twins for the first time in 5 years. Emily let him stand there watching his sons without pulling away, even as unease churned in her stomach. She knew this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. Daniel barely slept that night. His mind looped around the sight of Lucas and Jonah, his sons, playing quietly in that corner of the hotel. Their resemblance to him was undeniable, and the weight of their existence noted him like an ache he couldn't shake. He replayed every word Emily had said, dissecting the coldness in her tone, the defiance in her eyes. He couldn't blame her for the anger or for keeping the truth hidden. But that didn't make it easier to swallow. The next morning, Daniel showed up at the small diner where Emily worked part-time. He waited until the lunch rush died down, catching her by the counter. As she refilled a coffee pot, "Emily, I need to be part of their lives," he said without preamble. She didn't look up immediately, her hand steady as she poured. "I'm not stopping you from knowing them, Daniel, but there are limits." Finally, she met his gaze, her eyes colder than the previous night. "You don't get to walk in and disrupt everything. They don't know who you are. I'm not going to confuse them because you suddenly feel guilty." Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I'm not here out of guilt. I want to know them. I have a right to." Emily's eyes narrowed, and for a moment she looked as if she might throw the entire pot of coffee at him. "You forfeited that right the second you disappeared," she snapped. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he restrained himself. "I didn't disappear. I didn't even know," he replied, softly, sincerity edging his tone exactly. Emily shot back. "And now, after all these years, I've built something stable for them. I won't have you undo it if you want to be involved. You'll do it on my terms." Daniel nodded slowly, accepting the small sliver she was offering, knowing full well she wasn't ready to let him in completely. For now, the door remained only slightly ajar. Daniel began showing up regularly at the diner, not to force Emily's hand, but simply to observe from a distance. He'd take a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee for far longer than necessary, just to watch Emily work on weekends. He'd spot the twins darting in and out of the kitchen, bringing smiles to the waitstaff who had clearly grown attached to them, though he wasn't part of their world. Yet Daniel felt the pull more intensely with each visit. He couldn't shake the desire to know them, to fill the gaps he missed without telling Emily. Dan began paying off small things: outstanding daycare fees, overdue electric bills, even the rent she'd fallen behind on when Emily caught wind of it. She stormed over to his table one afternoon, hands on her hips, her apron still tied around her waist. "Stop it," she hissed, voice low to avoid a scene. Daniel arched a brow. "Stop what?" he asked innocently. "I don't need your charity," Emily grounded out. "I don't need you swooping in like some knight trying to fix everything with money." Daniel placed his cup down gently and met her eyes, his tone soft but firm. "I'm not doing this for you, Emily. I'm doing it for them. You can be angry with me, but don't take it out on the boys for a brief second." She wavered, the fire in her eyes dimming just slightly, but as quickly as it came, it passed, and she stepped back, shaking her head. "If you want to help find another way, they need More than money, Daniel watched her walk away, the truth of her words settling uncomfortably in his chest. He wasn't sure what it would take to break down her walls, but he knew he couldn't stop. Trying Lucas and Jonah were smarter than Emily, sometimes gave them credit for the more Daniel appeared at the diner, the more questions they began to ask Mom. Why does that man always sit there? Lucas asked one afternoon, balancing on the edge of the counter as he watched Daniel from afar. Emily froze momentarily as she packed leftover pastries into a box. Her back turned to the twins. Heck, just a customer, she replied casually, but Lucas's curious stare didn't waver. Jonah, always the quieter one, tugged on Lucas's sleeve. He smiles at us a lot, Jonah added, chewing on the end of his thumb, thoughtfully. Emily's grip tightened around the pastry box. Though she didn't turn around, Lucas tilted his head as if trying to piece together a puzzle at 5 years old. He wasn't yet capable of connecting the dots fully, but he sensed something more. He looks like us, Lucas whispered to Jonah, loud enough for Emily to hear. Her chest tightened at the observation. She had done her best to keep the twins from questioning the absence of a father, and up until now they had never pushed too hard. But Daniel's presence was stirring things she had fought to keep dormant. Emily glanced over her shoulder at the two of them and forced a smile. A lot of people might look like you, she said softly, tousling Lucas's hair in an attempt to redirect him. Focus on your drawings, okay? But even as they nodded and returned to their coloring books, Emily felt their gazes drift back to Daniel across the diner. Daniel met her eyes briefly, his expression unreadable. She could sense his longing, but she wasn't ready to open that door. Not yet, she prayed the boys wouldn't notice the cracks forming in her resolve. Daniel's patience surprised even him. In the past, when he wanted something, he made it happen swiftly, using charm, money, or sheer willpower. But Emily wasn't a business deal, and neither were Lucas and Jonah. This required something more, something he hadn't exercised in years. So instead of pushing harder, Daniel found ways to integrate himself naturally into their lives. He started volunteering at the daycare. The twins attended on weekends. At first, Emily's disapproval was palpable. She had cornered him in the hallway on his second day, crossing her arms tightly. "This isn't a way in, Daniel. I told you, don't confuse them," she warned. "I'm not here to confuse them," Daniel replied evenly, crouching to tie Jonah's loose shoelace. Jonah grinned at him, oblivious to the tension. "I'm just trying to be present." Emily watched him carefully, but something in his steady tone gave her pause. She didn't press further, though her eyes never strayed far from him. Whenever he was around the boys, Lucas, on the other hand, had started gravitating toward Daniel. Naturally, the boys' admiration was subtle, but unmistakable. Lingering glances, shy smiles, and excitement. When Daniel arrived at the daycare, Daniel didn't rush to claim a title or force explanations. Instead, he let the moments come quietly, helping Lucas with art projects, teaching Jonah how to balance on the jungle gym, and slowly Emily's resistance softened, though she rarely voiced it. She saw the way the boys thrived around Daniel. It was harder to deny that he brought something they had missed, even if she hated admitting it. Daniel wasn't asking for overnight forgiveness, and perhaps that was the only reason she let him stay. It was the annual Father's Day event at the daycare when Lucas made the first real connection. The room buzzed with excitement as children ushered in their fathers, each one holding handmade cards or clumsily wrapped presents. Emily sat quietly in the back, watching from the corner, with the other mothers who were playing dual roles. Lucas sat beside Jonah, card in hand, but his eyes kept drifting to Daniel, who stood nearby, speaking to one of the teachers. "Do you think he'd stay if we asked him?" Lucas whispered to Jonah, his small hands fidgeting nervously with the edges of the paper. Jonah shrugged, more interested in the cupcakes on the snack table. Finally, Lucas gathered his courage and walked toward Daniel. Emily's breath caught as she watched the scene unfold, unsure whether to step in. "Mr. Daniel," Lucas said shyly, holding out the small card with uneven handwriting that read, "Happy Father's Day." Daniel crouched down to meet him at eye level, his heart swelling as he accepted the card. "This for me?" Daniel asked softly, glancing at Emily, who stood frozen in the corner. Lucas nodded. "You're here a lot, I thought maybe you could stay." The boy explained simply, Daniel's throat tightened at the innocence behind the gesture. He smiled and ruffled Lucas's hair. "I'd love to stay," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Emily looked away, blinking rapidly to compose herself. She hadn't expected this as Daniel joined the boys at the crafts table. She realized that, despite her best efforts to keep him at arm's length, the cracks in her fences were beginning to grow. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was room for more. A week after the Father's Day event, Emily's world narrowed to the four walls of her small apartment. When Jonah fell ill, it started with a mild fever, but by nightfall his temperature spiked dangerously high. Emily sat by his bed, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth, while Lucas quietly colored at the kitchen table. Her heart clenched every time Jonah whimpered in his sleep. The weight of single parenthood bore down heavily in moments like these. She had no one to turn to, no backup plan, no support system other than herself. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jonah's breathing grew more labored and panic began to creep into her chest. Desperation made her swallow her pride. Emily grabbed her phone and, after hesitating, called Daniel. She hated involving him, but Jonah's health mattered more than her stubbornness. Daniel answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "I'll be there in 10. He said without question, true to his word. Daniel arrived shortly after carrying a small bag of over-the-counter medication. Emily opened the door, arms crossed, but eyes weary. "I didn't know who else to call," she admitted, stepping aside. Daniel didn't gloat or question her decision. He knelt by Jonah's bedside, gently brushing hair from the boy's damp forehead. "You did the right thing," he murmured, his tone soft but reassuring. For the next few hours, Daniel stayed by Jonah's side, holding his hand and humming softly until the boy's fever began to break. Emily watched quietly from the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. There was something about the way Daniel cared for their son that made her stomach twist, not in anger, but in guilt. Maybe she had been too harsh. Maybe for the first time she was starting to see him not just as the man who left, but as someone who wanted to stay the next day. Emily returned to the diner, blurry-eyed but grateful that Jonah's fever had subsided. Daniel had offered to pick up groceries for her, an offer she begrudgingly accepted as Emily wiped down tables. During the lunch rush, Natalie Silverstone, the last person she wanted to see, strode in like she owned the place. Heads turned as Natalie's expensive heels clicked against the floor, and Emily's heart sank. Natalie had always carried herself like royalty, and today was no different. With perfectly curled hair and a smug smile, she sauntered towards Emily with deliberate purpose. "Well, if it isn't," the mystery woman, Natalie said, her eyes scanning Emily dismissively. "I wondered how long it would take before you resurfaced." Emily stiffened, tightening her grip on the cleaning cloth. "I'm working. If you need something, ask another waitress," Emily replied coldly, hoping Natalie would lose interest. But Natalie wasn't one to let things go easily. "You think showing up with twins will secure you a piece of Daniel's wealth?" she sneered, lowering her voice. "I've seen this before, women crawling out of the woodwork once they realize who they've slept with." Emily's face flushed with anger, but she bit her tongue. "I don't need his money," she hissed, glaring at Natalie. "I'm raising them just fine on my own." Natalie's smile sharpened, but before she could retort, Daniel entered the diner. His gaze shifted between the two women, his expression darkening. "Natalie, leave," Daniel said firmly, stepping between them. "You have no right to come here." Natalie's eyes narrowed, but she eventually backed off-ing Emily. One last pointed glare before exiting, Daniel turned to Emily, an apology in his eyes. "I'm sorry, she won't bother you again," he promised. Emily exhaled slowly, her defenses rising once more. Daniel may have stepped in, but trouble seemed to follow wherever he went later that week. Lucas's natural curiosity began to bloom into full-blown suspicion. He had seen the interaction between his mother and Natalie, and the confrontation left lingering questions in his young mind that evening. As Emily tucked him into bed, Lucas clutched his stuffed dinosaur and stared at her with wide, searching eyes. "Mom," he began hesitantly, "why did that lady say stuff about Mr. Daniel today?" Emily froze, smoothing the blanket unnecessarily. "She was just being mean," she answered softly, brushing his curls from his forehead. "Don't worry about it." But Lucas wasn't satisfied. "She said something about us," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily swallowed hard, trying to formulate a careful response, but Lucas pressed on, "Is Mr. Daniel our dad?" The question hung heavily in the room, and Emily felt her throat tighten. Lucas's innocent gaze was unwavering, and she realized he wouldn't accept another vague excuse with a S. Emily sat on the edge of his bed and took his small hand in hers. "Yes," she admitted softly, "Mr. Daniel is your father." Lucas's eyes widened in surprise, and he shifted in bed, processing the revelation. "Why didn't he live with us?" Lucas's voice trembled slightly, and Emily squeezed his hand. "Gently, sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," she explained carefully. "But he's here now. He wants to know you and Jonah, and I think he's trying really hard to make up for not being here before." Lucas was quiet for a long moment before finally nodding. "I like him," he said simply. Emily's heart clenched as she kissed his forehead. "I know," she whispered as she left his room and leaned against the closed door. She realized there was no going back. Lucas's questions would only grow, and it was up to Daniel to prove he was ready for the role. The next morning, Emily woke to the sound of giggles coming from the living room as she entered. She found Lucas and Jonah sitting cross-legged on the carpet, stacking blocks. The innocence of the moment made her smile, but Lucas's curious gaze shifted toward her as she poured their cereal. "Mom." He began cautiously stirring his spoon. Why didn't Mr. Daniel know about us before? The question was inevitable, yet Emily felt the weight of it settle heavily on her shoulders. She sat beside them, taking a deep breath. Jonah, younger and more easily distracted, continued building his tower, but Lucas's eyes never wavered. Emily placed her hand over Lucas's. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said gently, "when I found out I was going to have you and Jonah. I didn't know how to tell him. I was scared, and sometimes adults think they're protecting their children by keeping things simple." Her voice softened as she tucked a loose curl behind his ear. "But I realized now that keeping secrets wasn't fair to you or Mr. Daniel." Lucas processed her words quietly, his brow furrowed in thought. "Does that mean he's going to live with us now?" he asked, his voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. Emily's heart tightened. "No, sweetheart," she replied, pulling him into a hug, but he'll be around more. He wants to be part of your lives, and I think that's a good thing." Lucas nodded slowly, as if accepting this new reality piece by piece. Jonah finally looked up from his tower and smiled, oblivious to the deeper meaning of the conversation. Emily kissed both of their foreheads, silently hoping Daniel could live up to their growing expectations. Later that week, Daniel unexpectedly arrived at the daycare, 2 small bicycles strapped to the back of his truck. Emily watched from the entrance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable as he unloaded them. "I thought they could use some bikes," Daniel explained, a nervous edge in his voice as he caught Emily's cautious stare. Lucas and Jonah ran toward the bikes with wide eyes, instantly drawn to the bright red frames and training wheels. "Is this okay?" Daniel asked quietly. Noticing Emily's hesitation, she exhaled, her gaze softening as she watched the boys inspect their gifts. "It's thoughtful," she admitted, though her pride made the words feel heavy on her tongue. Lucas clapped his hands excitedly, tugging at Daniel's sleeve. "Can you teach me to ride it?" he asked eagerly. Daniel smiled, kneeling to Lucas's level. "Of course, buddy," he replied. Jonah clung to Emily's leg, peering shyly at his new bike. "You can ride with me," Daniel added, gently patting Jonah's head. Emily felt her walls crumble just a little more as she watched Daniel's patient, attentive demeanor. There was a time when she believed he wouldn't have the capacity to step up like this, but each small effort chipped away at the image she once held of him. As Daniel adjusted the bike seat for Lucas, Emily sat on the bench, silently observing. Her sons deserve this, even if part of her wasn't ready to fully trust Daniel yet. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice barely audible over the laughter of the boys. Daniel looked up, locking eyes with her for a moment that felt significant, yet fleeting. "I'm trying," he replied softly. Emily nodded, acknowledging the sincerity in his words. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for growth for all of them. A week later, Daniel nervously paced outside Emily's apartment, his hands stuffed into his pockets. It was the first time she'd agreed to let him take the boys for the weekend, and though the opportunity thrilled him, the responsibility felt heavier than he anticipated when Emily finally opened the door. Lucas and Jonah bounded out, backpacks slung over their shoulders. Be good for Mr. Daniel. Okay. Emily instructed, kneeling to their level. I'll see you Sunday evening. The boys nodded enthusiastically, already eager to climb into Daniel's car as they drove to an amusement park just outside the city. Daniel glanced in the rear-view mirror, taking in their excitement. Lucas rattled off questions about roller coasters, while Jonah quietly gazed out the window, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Daniel's heart swelled with pride, but also anxiety. He wasn't sure how to entertain them for an entire weekend, but he knew he wanted to try at the park. Daniel held their hands tightly, navigating the crowds as they rode carousels, played arcade games, and devoured cotton candy. Later that night, back at Daniel's penthouse, the boys curled up on the couch watching cartoons, while Daniel ordered pizza. As he tucked them into the guest room, Lucas tugged his sleeve. I had fun today, he murmured, yawning. Daniel smiled, brushing his hair back. Me too, buddy. But as Daniel returned to the living room, a strange emptiness settled over him. The joy of the day was undeniable, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Emily, for the first time. He wondered if reconnecting with his children would also require reconnecting with her. Not just as their mother, but as someone he had once let slip away. The following week, the twins returned to school after their weekend with Daniel, brimming with excitement as they shared their stories with classmates. Lucas couldn't stop talking about the roller coasters and the giant stuffed bear. Daniel had one for him. Jonah, more reserved, quietly carried his memories with him, smiling at the thought of the fun they had, but as much as the weekend strengthened. Their bond, shadows from Daniel's past, began to creep in one afternoon. Lucas overheard two older boys whispering during recess. Did you hear about Lucas's dad? One of them snickered. My mom said he used to date some famous lady who threw a drink at him in a restaurant. Lucas didn't understand all of it, but the mockery in their voices stung. That evening, as Emily tucked him into bed, he hesitated, his eyes searching hers. Mom, is Daniel a bad person? The question caught her off guard, and she sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing his hair. Why would you ask that? She inquired softly. Though she suspected the source, Lucas shrugged, avoiding her gaze. Some kid said he got into trouble. Before Emily sighed, leaning in closer. People make mistakes, she explained, but that doesn't mean they can't change. What matters is how they learn from those mistakes. Lucas nodded slowly, but didn't seem entirely convinced as Emily kissed his forehead goodnight. She wondered if Daniel's past might jeopardize the trust they were working so hard to build. The next day, Emily called Daniel to discuss the incident. His voice was calm, but she could tell he was unsettled. I'll handle it, he promised, though. Emily remained wary. She had been through too much to let the boys become collateral damage in someone else's personal drama. Later that week, Daniel arrived at the diner. Just as Emily was finishing her shift, she greeted him with crossed arms and a guarded expression, already suspecting what brought him there. I wanted to talk, he said, his voice low, about Lucas's questions. Emily nodded, gesturing for him to sit across from her in a quiet corner booth. The diner hummed with soft conversation in the clinking of silverware, but their table felt isolated, wrapped in the weight of unspoken concerns. He's just a kid. Daniel, Emily began, her eyes narrowing. He doesn't need to hear gossip about things that happened years ago. Daniel's gaze fell to his hands, and for a moment he appeared more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. Back then, he said quietly, I let myself believe that image was everything. Being seen at the right places with the right people. I didn't care who I hurt as long as I looked successful. It was selfish, and it caught up to me. I know, he admitted, I'm not proud of the things I did back then. I was reckless and I hurt people, including you. Emily's heart tensed at the memory, but she let him continue. I used to think everything could be fixed with a check or a grand gesture, he added, his voice quieter now. Control the narrative, clean up the mess, move on. But life doesn't work that way. Not with people who matter. I can't erase the past, but I'm trying to be better for them. His sincerity was evident, but years of disappointment and hardship had made Emily wary of words alone. Trying isn't always enough, she replied softly. The boys need stability, not promises that might break. Daniel nodded, his eyes, finally meeting hers with quiet determination. I understand, he said, and I know I have to earn your trust as much as theirs. I just hope I can prove that I'm not the same man. Emily studied him for a long moment before exhaling. It's not about earning trust, she murmured. It's about showing up and staying. Daniel left the diner that night, with more hope than when he arrived, but also with the weight of knowing he still had a long road ahead. It was nearing midnight when Emily's phone buzzed on her nightstand, groggy and half asleep. She answered expecting a telemarketer or wrong number. Instead, she heard Lucas's panicked voice. "Mom, the car stopped and Jonah is scared." Emily bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Where are you?" she asked, already slipping into her jacket. Lucas sniffled. "On the other end. We're on the side of the road. Daniel is here." But his phone died. Relief washed over her, but only briefly. "Stay where you are. I'm coming." By the time Emily reached them, her headlights illuminating Daniel's car at the edge of a dark stretch of road. She was trembling with worry. Daniel stood outside waving her down with a flashlight, while the twins sat bundled in the back seat. "The engine overheated," Daniel explained, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't want to risk driving them further." Emily exhaled sharply, her frustration evident. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" she demanded, checking on the boys. Daniel glanced at his dead phone and shrugged. "I thought I could fix it before it became a problem," he muttered, then sighed. "It's a habit I'm trying to break, thinking I can control every outcome, like it's a meeting or a deal." Lucas crawled into Emily's arms and she kissed his forehead, holding him tightly. Jonah followed, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Daniel watched quietly, recognizing the fierce protectiveness in Emily's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said again, softer this time. Emily nodded, though she was still too shaken to say much, as she drove the boys home. Daniel followed closely behind, determined not to let them out of his sight that night. As Emily tucked them into bed, she lingered by their door, realizing that, for the first time, Daniel had been the one to step up during an emergency, and that mattered more than she wanted to admit. In the days following the roadside incident, a subtle shift began to take place. Daniel made a point to be more present, not just in the twins' lives, but in Emily as well. He dropped by the diner more frequently, helping the boys with homework during her late shifts, or simply sitting with them. While they ate, Emily couldn't deny the difference. His presence made the twins flourish under the attention, their bond with Daniel growing stronger with each passing day. Lucas had started, calling Daniel Dad without hesitation, while Jonah, more reserved, watched quietly but smiled brighter. Whenever Daniel was near, Emily found herself observing from a distance, arms crossed as she leaned against the diner's counter. It was strange to see Daniel slip so naturally into a fatherly role, a role he had never been prepared for, but embraced wholeheartedly. Despite the walls she had built, Emily couldn't help but acknowledge the warmth he brought into their small, simple lives. But with that warmth came fear, the fear that this fragile progress might crumble. If Daniel decided to walk away again, Emily had experienced too much disappointment to let hope bloom freely. But the sight of him teaching Jonah how to talk his shoes tugged at something in her heart. She thought had long since withered one evening, after the boys had fallen asleep at the booth waiting for her shift to end. Emily sat across from Daniel, the air between them heavy but calm. "You didn't have to stay tonight," she murmured, watching as he tucked Jonah's coat under his chin. Daniel smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on the twins. "I wanted to," he replied. Simply. Emily didn't argue. For the first time, she felt the cracks in her defenses beginning to widen. A week later, Daniel approached Emily with an unexpected proposal. They were sitting at the park watching the twins race down the slides, laughter ringing through the crisp autumn air. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, his tone careful. "What?" "If I invest in your catering business," Emily's eyes narrowed as she looked at him, skepticism flashing across her face. "I don't need charity," she said firmly, bristling at the suggestion. Daniel shook his head, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "It's not charity," he replied. "It's a partnership. You're talented, Emily. I've seen the way people line up at the diner just to eat the desserts you bring in. You could do more. If you had the resources." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but hesitated deep down. She knew he wasn't wrong. For years she had harbored dreams of opening her own catering company, but life's responsibilities had forced her to shove Those ambitions raising the twins alone had left little room for personal growth, let alone starting a business. Yet hearing Daniel acknowledge her talents stirred something long buried beneath her exhaustion. Still, her pride made her hesitate. Why now, she asked, searching his face for hidden motives. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. Because I want to help you build something for yourself and for them. I missed out on too much already. Let me do this. Emily watched the twins playing in the distance, their laughter echoing through the park. Maybe, just maybe, accepting his help wasn't a sign of weakness but of growth. I'll think about it. She finally said, her voice softer than before. Lucas's 6th birthday arrived with the excitement. Only children could. The twins woke up early, bouncing on Emily's bed until she groaned and pulled the covers over her head by noon. The small apartment was decorated with balloons and streamers, but the highlight of the day came when Daniel arrived, surprising. The boys with a brand new bicycle. Lucas's eyes widened in awe, and for a moment he stood speechless before lunging forward to hug Daniel tightly. "Thank you, Dad," he exclaimed, the words tumbling out. Naturally, Daniel froze for a second, his eyes flicking toward Emily, who stood by the kitchen counter, watching with a mix of caution and something softer, something close to approval. The small party carried on in full swing, with Emily's co-workers from the diner stopping by to celebrate the boys, played opening presents and stuffing themselves with cake until exhaustion settled in as the guests filtered out and the twins drifted to sleep on the couch. Emily quietly began cleaning up, but Daniel stepped in, taking the plates from her hands. "I'll handle it," he said softly. "You've done enough today." She hesitated, but let him as Daniel worked. The atmosphere shifted into something quieter, more intimate. Emily leaned against the doorway, watching him in the dim kitchen light. "They really love you," she said after a moment. Daniel paused, setting down the plate he had been trying. "I love them too," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I missed so much, but I want to make up for it, even if it takes years." Emily's heart ached at the sincerity. In his words, she knew the boys deserved this. But the question remained, did she? A week after Lucas's birthday, Daniel stood at Emily's doorstep, holding an envelope. The boys were asleep, and the late evening breeze brushed through the small apartment window, Emily wiping her hands with a dish towel looked at him. Curiously, "What's that?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Daniel hesitated for a brief second, then handed it to her. She unfolded the paper, her brows furrowing as she read the words, "A lease agreement." She questioned, glancing up at him with suspicion. "I bought a small apartment in the next neighborhood," Daniel explained, stepping further into the apartment. "It's closer to the boys' school, 3 bedrooms. I thought it might give you more space, something better for them." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line as she folded the paper back neatly. Her chest tightened, and she fought the immediate urge to hand it back. "Daniel, I can't accept this," she said firmly. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want to feel like we're some charity case you're managing." Daniel's eyes softened, and he shook his head. "It's not charity. It's for them. You deserve to have a better place. Emily, I'm not asking for rent. This is me giving them something. I should have years ago." Emily sighed, her fingers tightening around the envelope. The weight of his words lingered between them, heavy with unspoken history. A part of her wanted to reject it outright, but the image of Lucas and Jonah sharing a small room every night made her reconsider. "I'll pay rent," she said finally. "Maybe not much right now, but I won't take it for free." Daniel smiled faintly. "Deal," he replied just as Emily began adjusting to the changes Daniel brought into their lives. An unwelcome figure reappeared. Natalie, Daniel's ex, arrived, unannounced at the diner one afternoon, dressed in designer heels and carrying an air of superiority. She strolled in, her eyes scanning the small restaurant until they landed on Emily. "Well, this is quaint," Natalie said, her lips curling into a smirk. Emily sat down the coffee pot she had been holding, leveling Natalie with a calm yet cold stare. "Can I help you?" she asked, masking the irritation rising in her chest. Natalie stepped closer, lowering her sunglasses with a flick of her manicured hand. "I came to see the woman who managed to trap Daniel with the oldest trick in the look," she said smoothly. Her voice dripping with condescension, Emily crossed her arms, unimpressed. If you're here to start trouble, you can see yourself out. Emily replied, refusing to give her the satisfaction of reacting. Natalie laughed lightly, leaning over the counter. Oh, I'm not here to start trouble. I'm just making sure you know Daniel, and I have history. I doubt you can offer him what I did before Emily could respond. Daniel walked in, his eyes immediately darkened as he took in the scene. Natalie, he said sharply, crossing the room in long strides. What are you doing here? Natalie straightened, brushing her hair behind her shoulder. Relax. Daniel, I was just introducing myself to the mother of your children. Daniel stepped protectively beside Emily, his presence, solid and unwavering. We're done, Natalie. Whatever you're trying to pull, it won't work. Leave Emily and the boys alone. Natalie's smug expression faltered. She gave Emily one last glare before pivoting and leaving the diner in silence. Emily exhaled slowly. Thanks, she muttered. Daniel met her eyes. I'm not letting anyone mess with this, he said softly after Natalie's intrusion. Daniel and Emily found them sitting outside the diner, the sun dipping below the horizon. The boys were playing nearby, chasing each other under the fading light. Daniel rested his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground thoughtfully. I didn't expect her to show up, he admitted, shaking his head. Emily glanced at him, the quiet hum of the street filling the space between them. Neither did I, she replied, her voice softer now, but I appreciate you stepping in. Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze directly. I meant what I said. I don't want anyone causing problems for you or the twins. His sincerity was evident, and for the first time in years, Emily felt the weight of distrust lifting. If only slightly, I know, she murmured, leaning back against the bench. It's just hard to let my guard down. I spent so long doing everything alone. Daniel nodded, standing the depth of her words. I get it, he said quietly, but I'm here now. I'm not walking away. Emily watched the twins in the distance, their laughter echoing across the small park. A flicker of warmth settled in her chest. Maybe it's time I stop. Assuming the worst, she admitted with a small smile. Daniel leaned back beside her, his shoulder brushing lightly against hers. We've come a long way, Emily. I don't expect everything to be perfect, but I'm willing to keep trying. If you are, she didn't reply immediately. But the silence between them felt comfortable, like an old wound, slowly healing for the first time in a long while. Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. This time, as the weeks passed, Daniel and Emily's relationship began to shift. What once felt like strange co-parenting now resembled something closer to friendship. Daniel found reasons to linger after picking up the boys, and Emily didn't mind as much as she thought she would. Their conversation stretched longer into the evening, discussing school projects, the boy habits, and even lighter topics like Emily's new recipes at the diner. It wasn't a sudden shift, but rather a gradual, almost imperceptible change that grew stronger with each passing day. Emily couldn't deny the warmth that settled in her chest whenever she saw Daniel laughing with Lucas and Jonah one evening after the boys had gone to bed. Daniel stayed behind to help fix a leaky kitchen faucet as Emily handed him tools. She couldn't help but notice the quiet ease between them. You've gotten better at this, she teased, watching as he tightened the last bolt. Daniel chuckled. I've been practicing, he replied, his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly dismissed the feeling. Well, I guess I won't have to call a plumber next time, she said, trying to sound light-hearted. Daniel smiled, but didn't press further. They both knew something unspoken hung between them, but neither of them dared to name it. Later that night, as Emily lay in bed, she found herself replaying the evening. In her mind, she couldn't deny the feelings that were starting to resurface, feelings she thought she had buried long ago. But the thought of opening her heart again terrified her. Daniel had hurt her once before, and even though he was proving himself now, the scars of the past lingered. Emily knew that if they were to take another step forward, she would need to let go of the fear that kept her guarded. Daniel's hotel expansion plans had been in motion long before he discovered he had children. A new project in Seattle promised significant returns, and investors were eager for him to take the lead, but with each passing day spent with Lucas and Jonah, the idea of leaving town for months began to feel less appealing. Daniel sat at his desk late one night. The proposal in front of him untouched his mind. It kept drifting to the twins, laughter, to the way Jonah clung to his arm. Whenever he visited, and the pride in Lucas's eyes when Daniel attended his school play, the decision weighed heavily on Daniel. The hotel project wasn't just about profit. It was his legacy, the pinnacle of years of hard work. Yet he found himself wondering if success would mean anything without his sons by his side. For so long, legacy had meant buildings and contracts, magazine features and industry clout. Now it looked more like soccer games and bedtime stories. When Emily brought the twins to visit him at his hotel one afternoon, Daniel watched them race around the lobby giggling. As they played an impromptu game of tag and Emily chatted with the receptionist, Daniel knelt down to tie Jonah's shoelaces, his heart swelling with affection. It was in that moment he realized the truth. He couldn't leave. Not now. Not when he was just starting to build the relationship he'd missed out on for years. The following morning, Daniel called his business partner. "I'm stepping back from the Seattle project," he said firmly. His partner's disappointment was palpable. But Daniel didn't waver. "Family comes first," he added, glancing at a framed picture of Lucas and Jonah on his desk. As he hung up the phone, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he was prioritizing what truly mattered. And while the business world could wait, his son's childhood couldn't. He had spent years micromanaging every deal, every line and every contract, believing control equaled success. But standing there in the stillness of his office, he realized letting go of that control was the most freeing decision he'd ever made. With the Seattle project behind him, Daniel found himself with more free time, a rarity in his world. As summer approached, he proposed something that caught Emily off guard. "Let me take the boys on a vacation," Daniel said one afternoon while they watched Lucas and Jonah play at the park. Emily blinked in surprise, immediately shaking her head. "They've never been away from me for more than a night," she replied. Daniel's expression softened and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Come with us," he suggested. "It doesn't have to be just me and them. We could go together, as a family." Emily hesitated, but the twins overheard the conversation and instantly lit up. "Can we, Mom? Please?" Lucas begged, practically bouncing with excitement. Jonah joined in, tugging at Emily's sleeve. "I promise I'll behave," he chimed in. Emily looked at their hopeful faces and sighed in resignation. "Fine," she said, shooting Daniel a playful glare. "But if they get too hyper, it's on you." Daniel laughed, and the twins erupted in cheers. The following week, they set off for a quiet beach town along the coast. The boys spent their days building sandcastles, chasing waves, and collecting seashells. Emily found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in years. The weight of single motherhood briefly lifted by Daniel's presence one evening as the sun set over the horizon. Daniel and Emily sat on the porch of the beach house, sipping coffee, while the twins slept inside. "Thank you for this," Emily said softly. Daniel glanced at her, a tender smile tugging at his lips. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "I'm exactly where I want to be for the first time." In a long while, Emily believed him. The vacation had been more than just a getaway. It was a turning point for Daniel and Emily, an unspoken bridge connecting the fragments of their complicated relationship. The twins based in the joy of having both parents around, and for the first time, Daniel felt like a father in the truest sense one evening as the family sat around a campfire roasting marshmallows. Lucas leaned against Daniel, his small hands gripping his father's arm tightly. The stars overhead twinkled, and the soft sound of waves echoed in the distance out of nowhere. Lucas glanced up, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "I love you, Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling with sincerity. Daniel froze the marshmallow on his stick, forgotten as he processed the words, his heart dead in his chest. And for a moment he was certain he had misheard, but the way Lucas's gaze lingered, hopeful and vulnerable, left no room for doubt. Emily, seated across from them, watched silently, her eyes softening as she observed the moment. Daniel wrapped his arms around Lucas, pulling him into a firm hug. "I love you too, buddy," he whispered, his throat tightening with emotion. Jonah, not wanting to be left out, jumped onto Daniel's other side, giggling as he squished his way into the hug. "I love you too," Jonah announced loudly, his bright eyes dancing with joy that night as Daniel tucked the twins into bed. The weight of what had transpired settled over him. The love his sons had so freely given was more valuable than any business deal or hotel empire he had ever built. Standing by the doorway, Emily met his gaze. Her arms crossed as she leaned against the frame. "They're lucky to have you," she said softly. Daniel shook his head. "I'm the lucky one," he replied, fully aware that this was a chapter of his life he never wanted to close. The weeks following the vacation were filled with subtle changes that neither Daniel nor Emily spoke about, but felt deeply. Daniel began to spend more evenings at Emily's apartment, not just to see the boys, but to share dinner or help with bedtime routines. The boundary between co-parenting and something more had grown thin, yet neither rushed to define it. Daniel found solace in the ordinary moments, the way Emily hunged softly while cooking, the gentle teasing they exchanged while folding laundry, and the warmth that filled the small apartment every time he stepped through the door. One afternoon, the twins had their first soccer game. Daniel and Emily stood together on the sidelines, cheering as Lucas scored his first goal. Jonah, distracted by butterflies, chased them across the field until his coach gently redirected him. Emily laughed, covering her mouth with her hand, and Daniel found himself captivated by the sound. "You know," he said, watching her with a soft smile, "I don't think I've ever seen you this happy." Emily glanced at him, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Maybe I'm finally learning to let things go," she admitted, her voice laced with quiet honesty. As the game ended, Lucas and Jonah ran toward them, faces flushed with excitement. Daniel scooped Jonah up, while Lucas clung to Emily's waist. "We did it, Dad," Jonah grinned. Daniel kissed the top of his head, holding him a little tighter. In that moment, Daniel knew they had found something rare, a fragile, imperfect family, stitched together by love, forgiveness, and time. As they walked back to the car hand in hand, Daniel felt the future stretching before him, bright and full of promise. For the first time in years, it wasn't his business ventures or ambition that defined him. It was the simple act of being present, building a life alongside the people he loved most. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching,